It was 7 in the morning when Gideon Vitale sat down in the front room of his Brookline estate, wearing the tinted glasses he'd started keeping on even indoors, and poured himself one finger of whiskey from his father's old crystal decanter, the same ritual, the same hour, every morning, for 11 years. He was 38. He was the most feared man on the Boston waterfront, and for 5 months he'd been quietly going blind. 4 specialists had signed their names to it. There wasn't a treatment, and there wasn't a cure. He lifted the glass. He never got to drink it. A woman came across that room so fast the guards didn't have time to move, and she knocked the glass clean out of his hand. Crystal shattered across the stone floor. 4 weapons came up at once, and Daphne Donovan, 27 years old, the maid nobody in that house had ever bothered to look at twice, dropped to her knees in the broken glass, shaking, and said the words that stopped everything. "You're not going blind. Somebody's been poisoning you." Gideon Vitale didn't shout. He didn't even stand up. He simply raised one hand, and every gun in that room went still. Because if this woman was telling the truth, then whoever was taking the light out of his eyes hadn't once set foot outside his own home. If a story like this stays with you, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Share it with someone who'd appreciate it, and subscribe if you haven't yet. Now, let's get on with today's story. His hand remained raised in the air for several seconds more, then lowered slowly. "Everybody out." He didn't speak loudly. None of the 4 men needed to hear it twice. They put away their guns, stepped back, and the door closed behind the last man with a dry, hard click. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, still holding a broom in one hand, her mouth opening as though she meant to say something. Gideon only gave the slightest shake of his head, and she withdrew as well. Only 2 people remained in the room, a man seated in an armchair and a woman kneeling among the broken pieces. He raised a hand and removed his amber-tinted glasses, folded them, and placed them on the table beside him. The world before him immediately dissolved into a painful wash of white light, and within that brightness, the girl became nothing more than a dark, blurred shape, faceless, without any clear form. He didn't know whether she was looking at him or bowing her head. He didn't know how old she was. He wasn't even certain whether he'd ever heard her name before. "Say it again," he said. Her voice broke on the first word before steadying itself. She said she couldn't be certain, but she'd been watching for weeks, and there were 2 things she couldn't explain. The first was the level of liquor in the crystal decanter. Every morning she cleaned the table in this room, and she'd grown accustomed to watching the level drop gradually from one day to the next, by exactly a finger's width each morning, no more and no less. Every Thursday, the decanter would be filled again, but that morning was Monday, and when she came in at 6:45, the level in the decanter was higher than it had been the day before. She'd stood there staring at it for a long moment, telling herself she must have remembered wrong, and then she'd let it go. The second thing had happened 10 minutes earlier. The service room connected to the sitting room through a wooden door that was always left slightly ajar, and when she passed by to get a cleaning cloth, she'd looked through the narrow opening and seen the back of someone standing beside the table. Only a person's back. Whoever it was had been facing the window, favoring their left side slightly as they reached toward the table. She hadn't seen the person's face and couldn't say with certainty which of the dozens of people who came and went through this house every day it had been, but that subtle stiffness in the movement had stayed with her. She only knew that there wasn't supposed to be anyone in the sitting room at that hour because he hadn't come downstairs yet, and everyone else was in the kitchen area. Gideon didn't ask another question about the figure she'd seen. He asked something else. He asked why a cleaning woman cared about the level of liquor in her employer's decanter. She was silent for several seconds before answering that she'd studied nursing for 2 years before circumstances forced her to quit. And during those 2 years, she'd been taught that when a symptom didn't fit the diagnosis, it wasn't the symptom that was wrong. She said the illness people claimed he had usually progressed in a different way. It usually began in one eye before spreading to the other several weeks later. It usually took away the center of a person's vision first, leaving the patient unable to read while still able to walk normally. But his vision had blurred evenly in both eyes at the same time, closing in from the edges toward the center. And he was so sensitive to light that he had to draw the curtains in the middle of the day. She said she wasn't a doctor. She said she might be wrong, but she'd been thinking about it for months, and she couldn't sleep anymore. 5 months, Gideon said. You saw all of that in 5 months. Why didn't you say anything? A long silence followed. Then she answered, and her voice had become calm again, so calm it sounded almost indifferent. Because I'm only the cleaning woman. Nobody ever asks me anything. Gideon remained still. He listened as she picked up the pieces of glass one by one and placed them in her palm, heard the faint clinking as the shards touched each other. "Leave it," he said. "Go outside." She stood. She didn't thank him, didn't apologize, didn't ask whether she was going to be fired. He listened to her footsteps as she walked out, and he didn't say another word to her. When the door had closed, he reached for his glasses again, put them on, and called for the housekeeper. Iris Bell entered and stood waiting. Gideon spoke loudly enough for his voice to carry into the hallway, loudly enough for the 4 men outside to hear every word clearly, saying that the maid had been so clumsy that morning she'd dropped the entire tray and shattered his wineglass, that he didn't want to hear about anything like that happening again, and that 2 weeks of her wages were to be deducted. The housekeeper acknowledged him and withdrew. The door closed once more. The room was completely empty. Gideon stood. He walked to the corner of the table, lowered himself onto one knee, and began picking up every shard of crystal with his own hands, wrapping all of them inside a cloth, including the liquor that still pooled in the hollow of one large broken piece. He folded all 4 corners of the cloth inward, tied it securely, placed it in the bottom drawer, and locked it. Then he did one final thing. He picked up the crystal decanter, returned it to the exact place where it had been sitting on the table, and turned the silver label around its neck until it rested at precisely the same angle it had held for the past 11 years. He didn't pour the liquor out. Whoever had put something into that decanter was still inside this house and would still walk into this room tomorrow. If Gideon changed even one small habit, that person would know immediately, and someone who knew they'd been discovered wouldn't wait another 5 months. What had brought him to that morning had begun on a Tuesday in the middle of May, and it had started with something so small that he couldn't remember giving it more than 3 seconds of thought. That day, he was sitting with the quarterly revenue reports from several warehouses along Conley Wharf, and in the middle of a long column of numbers, one line suddenly blurred. Just one line. He blinked twice, and it became sharp again, dark and clear against the white paper. He turned to the next page and forgot about it before the morning was over. 3 weeks later, during the monthly meeting with the capos in the large dining room, he looked up to speak to the men seated at the far end of the table, and saw that 3 faces there were dissolving into a gray mist. He knew those 3 men well. He knew every scar, every wrinkle, every way each of them smiled. But in that moment, they were nothing more than 3 pale shapes floating at the other end of the room, while the men seated near him remained as clear as ever. He said everything that needed to be said, his voice steady, never missing a beat, then ended the meeting 15 minutes early. No one noticed anything. At the beginning of June, he set his phone down on the table to his right, turned to speak with someone else for about a minute, then reached for it again. His hand closed on empty air. He turned his head and saw the phone still lying exactly where he'd left it, untouched. He'd simply reached in the wrong direction, missing it by about 8 inches. He sat there for a long time afterward, his hand still resting on the tabletop, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider that this wasn't lack of sleep, but the night that truly frightened him came near the end of June on Starrow Drive. He was driving himself, as he often did whenever he wanted to be alone, when a car approaching from the opposite direction switched on its high beams. The light didn't merely glare, it drove straight behind both of his eyes like a drill, and for 3 full seconds he couldn't see anything at all. Not the lane, not the guardrail, not even the hood of his own car. He turned the wheel to the right on instinct, pulled onto the shoulder, shut off the engine, and sat motionless in the darkness for nearly half an hour until the Charles River beyond the road slowly returned as a black strip with a recognizable shape. He hid everything. He hid it for another 4 weeks. He replaced the bulbs in his office with dimmer ones, increased the font size on every document brought to him, moved meetings to the late afternoon when the light had softened, and began letting his driver take the wheel under the excuse that he wanted to use the time on the road to make phone calls. No one in the organization noticed. By the beginning of July, he couldn't hide it any longer, and the first person he told was Julian Croft. They sat in the study late that night, and Gideon recounted those 4 moments in the voice of a man delivering a situation report, not a man asking for help. Julian listened to all of it without interrupting once, both elbows resting on his knees. When Gideon finished, Julian remained silent for a moment, then said that not one word of this could be allowed outside, because there were at least 4 organizations out there waiting for exactly this kind of sign. Then Julian said he knew someone, Dr. Preston Hale, a neuro-ophthalmologist with a private practice who accepted patients only through referral and, most importantly, there was accustomed to working with families who didn't want their names appearing in any record. Julian told him to let him arrange it. Gideon nodded. The next 3 weeks passed in appointments that never appeared on any calendar. He entered through private doors, sat in windowless rooms, let people shine lights into his eyes, test his visual fields, perform scans, draw blood, attach electrodes to both temples, and each time it was over, he went home having been told nothing except that they needed more data. Julian drove him there and brought him home through all 3 weeks, never missing a single appointment. On August 8th, Hale called him in to discuss the results. He spread several sheets of paper across the desk, gave the disease a long clinical name, then shortened it to 4 letters and explained that it was a very rare hereditary form of optic nerve degeneration, that there was no cure, and that no surgery could stop it. Gideon asked how long. Hale said 12 months, perhaps less, and that at the end of that road would be total blindness, irreversible. Gideon sat still and listened to everything. Then he asked exactly one question, and he asked it in an ordinary voice, as though he were clarifying some procedural detail. This disease is hereditary. Did my mother have it? Hale answered immediately, without needing to think, saying that this form was inherited through the maternal line but could remain hidden for generations without appearing in anyone, and that medical literature had documented many cases in which the mother remained completely healthy while the child developed the disease. He spoke smoothly and clearly, without stumbling over a single word. Gideon asked nothing else. He gave one small nod, stood, fastened the button of his coat, thanked the doctor with a brief sentence, and walked out. His car was parked in the underground garage. He got inside, closed the door, and sat there. He didn't start the engine. He didn't call Julian, didn't call his lawyer, didn't call anyone. He sat motionless in the darkness of that garage for 2 hours, both hands resting on his thighs, staring straight ahead at a concrete wall that, at that time, he could still see clearly. The second person to learn about it was Serena Whitlock. She was 31, the youngest daughter of a family that had sold and bought back nearly a quarter of the old buildings on Beacon Hill across 4 generations, and she'd been wearing Gideon's ring for 3 years. In those 3 years, he'd seen her cry exactly once. Not when her grandmother died. Not when one of her closest friends spent 4 months in the hospital. It had happened on a spring afternoon, when her car was returned from the parking garage with a scratch, about 8 inches long, running along the left door. She stood staring at that scratch and then began to cry. Truly cry. Her shoulders trembling, tears running down her chin. And it took 20 minutes before she could speak in complete sentences again. Gideon remembered that. He remembered it the way he remembered everything, without judgment, without drawing conclusions, simply storing it somewhere in his mind and leaving it there. He told her about the diagnosis during the 2nd week of August, in the study, briefly, without adding or leaving out anything. She reacted exactly as a woman should have reacted. She raised both hands and held his face, told him she wasn't going anywhere, that 3 years wasn't something a person abandoned because of a doctor's piece of paper, that if he went blind, she would be his eyes. She said those things with enough tears and at all the right breaths, and for the first 3 weeks, she kept every word. She came every evening. She sat beside him in the darkness, without asking him to turn on the lights. She read his correspondence aloud to him. She called him in the middle of the morning just to ask whether he'd eaten anything. Then, in the 4th week, she began arriving late. Only half an hour at first, then an hour, then one evening she sent a message saying she was stuck at a charity dinner and would stop by afterward, and by the time she arrived, it was nearly 11 o'clock. She began leaving early. Before, she would stay until he grew sleepy. Then she stayed 40 minutes, then 20. And there was one detail that only a man who was slowly losing his sight would have noticed. Because when the eyes begin to fail, the ears and hands take turns doing their work. Before, the first thing she did when she entered the room was remove her gloves and place them on the table. From the middle of September onward, she stopped taking them off. She sat down with the gloves still on her hands, and when she held his hand, all he could feel was a layer of leather between the two of them. He didn't ask her about it. He didn't ask her about anything throughout that entire month. On the night of September 12th, she arrived at around 9 o'clock. He heard the sound of her heels in the hallway before the door opened, and from the rhythm of those footsteps alone, he knew she hadn't come to stay. She entered and stopped in the middle of the room. She didn't take off her coat. She didn't sit in the chair opposite him as she always had before. She simply stood there, while Gideon remained seated in his armchair, looking toward her through the gray haze that grew thicker with every passing day. She said she'd been thinking about it for weeks. She said she'd tried. She said she wasn't strong enough for this, that she knew she was doing something terrible, and that she was sorry. Then she reached out and placed the ring on the table between them. It touched the wood with a sound so faint it was almost impossible to hear. Gideon said nothing. He didn't stand, didn't ask her to repeat herself, didn't demand another word of explanation. He simply sat there, looking in her direction, and remained silent. She waited. He realized she was waiting, and he realized she'd prepared herself for every possibility. If he shouted, she would cry and say she understood, that he had every right to be angry. If he begged, she would soften her voice and tell him this was best for both of them, that he deserved someone who could stay beside him completely. If he coldly ordered her out, she would walk straight away and tell the story to her friends in a way that made her the one who'd been hurt. She'd rehearsed all of it. But she hadn't rehearsed silence. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Serena shifted her weight from one foot to the other. She opened her mouth as if to say something else, then stopped. Her gloved hand tightened, then relaxed. And finally, when there was nothing left to wait for, she turned and walked out. The door closed. The sound of her heels faded down the hallway and disappeared entirely near the top of the stairs. Gideon remained in his chair for a long while afterward. Then he reached out, not to pick up the ring, but only to brush it from the edge of the table with the back of his hand. It fell to the floor, rolled a long way across the dark room, struck the leg of the bookcase in the far corner, and came to rest there. He didn't get up to retrieve it. The next morning, when the cleaning woman asked whether he needed her to look for anything that might have fallen, he told her there was nothing. The ring remained there for many months afterward, slowly gathering dust in the darkness beneath the bookcase, and in that house, only 2 people knew where it lay. After that night, Gideon Vitale didn't leave the study for 6 weeks. The curtains remained drawn day and night, and no one was allowed to open them, not even to clean the windows. He canceled the monthly meeting with the capos and didn't reschedule it. He stopped taking phone calls, stopped signing papers, stopped answering even the calls he would have picked up on the very first ring 7 months earlier. People began whispering in the kitchen and out by the motor court, and those whispers stopped precisely at the threshold of the study. Because during those 6 weeks, only one person was permitted to cross that threshold. Julian Croft arrived every morning at around 9 o'clock, carrying a briefcase full of files, sat down in the chair across from him, and began working as though nothing had changed. He read every clause in the warehouse leases, every number in the weekly reports, every name on the list of new people, and he read slowly enough for Gideon to hold each detail in his mind without having to look at the page. Whenever a signature was needed, Julian placed his index finger at the exact spot on the line so Gideon would know where to put the pen, and he did it so naturally that not once did he make Gideon feel as though he was being helped. In the afternoon, he returned with reports from the harbor. In the evening, if there was anything worth knowing beyond the city, he came back yet again. 6 weeks, without missing a single day, including Sundays, including 2 days when he had a high fever that Gideon didn't learn about until 3 weeks later from someone else. And once every week, on Thursday afternoon, Julian went down to the wine cellar, took a bottle from the row of shelves Gideon's father had arranged more than 20 years earlier, and filled the crystal decanter on the table with his own hands. He never left that task to the servants. The first time he did it, Gideon told him not to bother, that he'd stopped drinking. Julian set the bottle down, filled the decanter, replaced the stopper, and said the old man wouldn't want to see him give up this habit. There was no humor in his voice when he said it. Gideon's father had drunk 1 finger of liquor at 7 o'clock every morning until the final morning of his life, and Gideon had continued that ritual from the day the old man died, for 11 years, without missing a single morning. Julian knew that, and Julian wouldn't let him stop. From that day on, the decanter was always full every Thursday. There were evenings when the 2 men didn't talk about work. One night, near the end of September, when Gideon asked why he didn't take even 1 day off, Julian laughed and brought up what had happened on Route 93. 12 years earlier, on a rainy night, his car had overturned into a ditch beside the road and remained lying on its side there for nearly 40 minutes, and during those 40 minutes, at least 9 cars had passed without a single one stopping. The 10th car stopped. The man who stepped out was Gideon, 26 years old at the time, and he had waded down into the mud, pulled Julian from the driver's compartment with his own 2 hands, then driven him straight to the hospital without asking who he was. Julian said that if the 10th car had passed him too, he'd have died in that ditch, so waking up 2 hours earlier every day for 6 weeks wasn't worth discussing. As for his left shoulder, everyone in the organization knew about it, and no one dared mention it to his face as a joke. 7 years earlier, at a warehouse in Chelsea, a delivery had been ambushed, and Julian had thrown himself between Gideon and the raised barrel of a gun. The bullet passed through his shoulder. He spent 19 days in the hospital. From that day forward, the scar became a kind of unquestioned credential that no one in the Vitali organization dared challenge, not even the capos who had served since Gideon's father's time. People could suspect anyone in that house, but no one suspected a man who had stepped in front of his own boss when someone pulled the trigger. During the final week of those 6 weeks, late one night after the 2 men had been sitting in silence for a long while, Gideon told him that he'd thought carefully about what was coming. He said there would come a time when he wouldn't be able to read anymore, wouldn't be able to recognize people's faces anymore, and when that day came, everything he possessed would be in the hands of the man sitting across from him at that very moment. He said it without any heaviness, as though they were discussing a clause in a contract. Then he added one more sentence, one he would remember many times afterward. He said that in his entire life, he trusted Julian more than he trusted himself. Julian didn't answer immediately. He sat quietly for a moment, then stood, walked around the desk, placed one hand on Gideon's shoulder, and gave it a single squeeze, firm and brief. Only once. He didn't say a word. Then he gathered the files into his briefcase, switched off the desk lamp, and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind him just as he'd done throughout those 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, and throughout the 5 months before and after them, there was another person who crossed the threshold of the study almost every day, except no one ever counted her on any list. Daphne Donovan's alarm rang at 4:15 in the morning. She caught the first bus from her one-room apartment in Allston, arrived at the side gate of the Brookline mansion at 5 minutes to 5, and began her shift at exactly 5 o'clock. She cleaned the first-floor hallway first, then the large dining room, then the main kitchen, and only after that did she move on to the sitting room. She worked during the hours when the entire house was still asleep, and she'd grown accustomed to moving through those enormous rooms without making a sound. Her shift ended at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. She walked 10 minutes to the stop, took 2 buses down to Quincy, and at exactly 3 o'clock she was standing behind the counter of a diner on Hancock Street, tying on an apron and beginning her second shift. That shift ended at 9 o'clock at night. She had 40 minutes to eat a sandwich on the bus before getting off at the final stop. And at exactly 10 o'clock, she swiped her card at a warehouse near Southampton Street, where she labeled and stacked boxes until 2 in the morning. 3 hours of sleep. Then, at 4:15, the alarm rang again. She did that 6 days a week. On the 7th day, Sunday, she didn't work at all. She took the red line from downtown and stayed on it until the final stop in Braintree, then walked another 15 minutes to a memory care center hidden behind a row of trees. She always arrived at 11 o'clock, because that was the time of day when her mother was most lucid. Nora Donovan was 58 years old. 7 years earlier, she'd suffered a stroke, and over the 7 years that followed, her memory had slowly retreated like water pulling away from a stretch of sand, leaving behind scattered fragments with no order to them. She didn't remember her daughter's name. Some days she called Daphne the nurse. Some days she called her the little girl from next door, and some days she simply stared at her for a long time before asking who she was. But there was one question she never forgot. Almost every time, after about 10 minutes, she would turn toward the window and ask whether Tom was home yet. And every time, Daphne gave her the same answer, that he'd be home soon, that she should rest, that he'd be back soon. Daphne stayed for 40 minutes, brushed her mother's hair, trimmed her fingernails, then took the train back into the city. The cost of that care center was $9,200 a month. All 3 of her jobs combined, after taxes, allowed her to pay $3,100. She still owed $71,000 in hospital bills and loans from those first years, and she'd calculated that if she never got sick for even one day, if no bus ever broke down, if nothing unexpected happened at all, she would finish paying everything off at around the age of 50. Inside her staff locker at the mansion was a photograph, and it was the only thing in that locker that wasn't work equipment. The picture showed a man standing beside a black car, one hand resting on the roof, smiling at whoever was holding the camera. Thomas Donovan had worked as a private driver for the Vitale family for 9 years. He died in a warehouse in Chelsea on a November night 7 years earlier, at the age of 39. Around Daphne's wrist was his watch, an oversized man's watch that she had to fasten through the innermost hole in the leather strap, and that was still too loose, sliding back and forth whenever she scrubbed the floors. The Boston police closed the case after 7 weeks, with the final line carrying the conclusion: no suspects. No one was arrested. No one was questioned more than twice. There was no trial, but at her father's funeral, when Daphne was 20 years old and standing in the hallway behind the funeral home, she overheard 2 men from the organization talking in a hidden corner. One of them said that the shipment that night had come directly from the top, and that Tom was never supposed to run that route because that route wasn't a driver's job. The other man immediately told him to shut up. Neither of them said another word, and both walked away when they realized someone was nearby. 7 years later, Daphne still remembered every word exactly. She hadn't applied for the job at the Brookline mansion because of the money, even though she needed money more desperately than anyone else in that house. She'd come because she wanted to know who had given that order. She'd come because being inside a man's house allowed you to see things that 7 years of standing outside his door could never reveal. She'd been cleaning the floors of that house for 5 months, opening every drawer she was permitted to open, listening to every sentence people spoke when they forgot there was someone wiping down the hallway 3 steps away, and she still hadn't found anything. That morning, after the housekeeper finished reading the decision to deduct 2 weeks of her wages and told her to go downstairs, Daphne walked out to the steps behind the kitchen and sat down. Both of her hands were still trembling. She looked down at them and thought about how she'd had 3 seconds to make a choice. 3 very short seconds. And in those 3 seconds, she'd crossed the room to save the very man she'd spent 7 years hating. She sat there for a long time and couldn't find an answer for herself. At 9 o'clock that night, the housekeeper came down to the staff quarters and told Daphne that the boss wanted to see her. Daphne was getting ready to leave for the bus stop and head to her night shift at the warehouse. She took off her coat, hung it back inside her locker, and followed the housekeeper upstairs. The housekeeper stopped at the head of the hallway and went no farther. There was no one standing guard outside the study. Daphne knocked twice, then stepped inside. Only one low-wattage desk lamp was burning in a far corner of the room, and Gideon sat in his armchair, still wearing the amber-tinted glasses even though it had been dark outside for hours. He pointed toward the chair across from him. She sat on the edge of it, both hands resting on her thighs. He didn't ask whether she was tired, didn't ask about the deduction from her wages, and didn't mention anything about that morning. He asked her to tell him exactly what she'd seen, in precise chronological order, leaving nothing out and adding nothing. Daphne began at 6:45, when she opened the supply cabinet in the service room. She said she'd passed the wooden door that was left slightly ajar while going to get a cleaning cloth at 6:50. And during the 2 or 3 seconds it took her to cross that narrow opening, she'd seen the back of someone standing beside the table, facing the window. She said she hadn't stopped, hadn't looked a second time. And when she came back out, there was no one left in the room. She said she'd entered the sitting room at 6:45 and noticed that the liquor in the decanter stood about 1 finger joint higher than it had the day before. She said she remembered clearly because she'd cleaned that table 360 times over 5 months, and the level of that liquor was something she saw every morning. She said the decanter was only refilled on Thursday afternoons, and that day was Monday. Then she stopped and said that was everything. She didn't say whom she suspected. She didn't say what she thought. She gave 3 points in time, 1 visual observation, 1 observation about routine, and stopped exactly where the facts stopped. Gideon sat motionless and listened to all of it. He'd listened to thousands of people give reports over the course of his life, and he knew that the overwhelming majority of people didn't tell things that way. People mixed feelings into the middle of facts. They skipped ahead. They emphasized the parts they wanted others to believe. This girl didn't. She numbered the points in time, separated what she'd seen from what she'd inferred, and stopped precisely at the boundary between the two. That was the manner of someone who'd been trained to make notes another person could later read and understand. He asked where she'd studied nursing. There was a very brief pause before she answered, so brief that if he could still see her face clearly, perhaps he wouldn't have needed to notice it. But he couldn't see clearly anymore, And because of that, over the past 5 months, his ears had learned to do the work his eyes no longer could. She gave the name of a community college north of the city. She said the name of the school half a beat faster than she'd spoken the sentences before it, and her voice rose at the final syllable as though she were waiting to see whether the person listening believed her. Gideon said nothing. He didn't ask which program she'd been in, didn't ask what year she'd dropped out, didn't ask why. He only gave a single nod. Then he told her she could go. Daphne stood, offered a very quiet good night, and walked out. When the door had closed and the sound of her footsteps had disappeared all the way down the stairs, Gideon opened the bottom drawer on the left side of his desk. Inside, beneath a stack of old papers, was a cheap flip phone purchased with cash at a convenience store. A phone that had never called any number connected to the organization, and no one in the house knew it existed. He switched it on and dialed a number he'd known by heart for more than 20 years. The person on the other end answered after 3 rings and said nothing, simply waited. Aldo Mancuso was 60 years old, the longest-serving capo in the Vitali organization, and he'd begun working for Gideon's father before Gideon was old enough to walk. In those 30 years, he'd received hundreds of orders, including orders that anyone else would have demanded an explanation for, and not once had he asked why. Gideon told him there was a cleaning girl in the house named Daphne Donovan, and he wanted to know everything about her. He said he wanted to know where she'd been born, whom she lived with, what work she did, whom she owed and how much, and he wanted to know where she'd studied nursing, how many years she'd studied, and why she'd dropped out. He said he needed it within 1 week. Then he added one final sentence, spoken in exactly the same calm voice he used for every procedural instruction. He said this wasn't to go through the usual channels, nothing was to be written down anywhere, and Julian wasn't to be told. The voice on the other end answered yes, and hung up without asking another word. Gideon folded the phone shut, returned it to the drawer, locked it, and sat for a long time in the darkness. Some truths can't be looked at directly. You have to circle around behind them, following the same path they used when they slipped quietly into your life. The second call he made was later that same night, from the same phone. Miriam Kessler was 64 years old and had worked as a forensic pathologist for Suffolk County for 11 years before leaving the field, and for nearly 30 years she'd been the private physician to the Vitali family, the woman who had stitched them back together in kitchens and bedrooms where no medical record had ever been created. She was also the one who had sat beside Gideon's father's bed throughout his final night, and the one who had closed the old man's eyes the following morning. Gideon said exactly 2 things to her: that he needed her to come that night, and that she had to enter through the wine cellar door. She arrived at 11:15. The door was set beneath the stone wall at the western corner of the garden, hidden behind a curtain of climbing vines, and it opened into a narrow brick passage that ran underground to the wine cellar beneath the house. Gideon's father had ordered it built in the 1970s, and on the entire property, it was the only entrance without cameras, without a guard shift, without any record of who came or went. She climbed the spiral staircase inside the wine cellar and entered the study carrying an old black leather bag. Gideon offered no explanation. He rolled his left sleeve to the elbow and placed his arm on the table. Then he took the cloth with its 4 corners tied together from the locked drawer and pushed it toward her. He said that inside were the pieces of a broken glass, and that on one large shard there was still some liquor that hadn't completely dried. He said he didn't need to know what disease he had. 4 people had already put their names on that conclusion, he said, and he no longer cared about that piece of paper. What he needed to know was what was in his blood. He listed exactly what he wanted her to look for: heavy metals, industrial solvents, synthetic compounds, anything that could be introduced into a person's body in very small doses, repeatedly, and at regular intervals, over the course of many months without causing any acute symptoms. He told her he wanted the testing done in her private laboratory, that no sample was to be sent anywhere else, that his name was not to be written down anywhere, and that she was to tell no one. Miriam Kessler didn't answer immediately. She stood there looking at him for a long time, long enough that he began to hear the ticking of the clock on the mantel. She'd known him since he was an 8-year-old boy who had broken his arm falling down the stairs. She'd heard him say many things over the course of 30 years, but she'd never heard him say this. Then she set down the bag, opened its clasps, and began to work. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask whom he suspected. When she was finished, she wrapped the cloth again, sealed it inside a bag, packed everything into the leather case, and said she needed 7 to 9 days, perhaps longer if she had to run the tests a second time. She left by the same route she'd used to enter. At 7 o'clock the following morning, Gideon came down to the sitting room at exactly the same time he had for 11 years. Julian was already there with the folder resting on his lap. Gideon poured exactly 1 finger of liquor into the new glass, lifted it, touched the rim to his lips, held it there long enough, then set it back down on the faint circle the bottom of the glass had left on the tabletop for so many years. Julian looked up, gave him a nod in greeting, then opened the folder and began reading the weekly report. He saw exactly what he saw every morning. After Julian left and the door had closed, Gideon stood, picked up the glass that was still nearly full, walked to the corner of the room where a Phalaenopsis orchid sat on a low wooden stand, and poured all of the liquor into the layer of pine bark covering the pot. He did it during the exact stretch of time when he knew no one would be passing through the hallway, and he poured slowly so the liquid would soak downward instead of collecting in a pool. Then he rinsed the glass with water in the small adjoining washroom, dried it, and returned it to its place. He repeated the same thing the next morning, then the morning after that. By the 4th day, he no longer had to think through each movement. By the 6th day, he had begun paying attention to the orchid. On the 9th morning, when he walked toward the corner of the room, as he always did, he stopped. The 2 lowest leaves on the orchid had changed color. They weren't withered, weren't drooping, and showed no sign of lacking water. They had simply changed from deep green to a pale yellow that began along the edges and spread slowly inward along the veins. The 3rd leaf was beginning to fade at its tip. That orchid had stood in the same corner of the room for more than 2 years, and had flowered faithfully every spring, cared for by the gardener himself on a fixed schedule, no more and no less. Gideon stood there looking at it for a long time. He didn't bend down to touch the leaves, didn't call anyone upstairs, didn't say a word. Then he poured the rest of the liquor in his hand into the pot, turned away, and walked back to his desk. Miriam Kessler returned at 2 o'clock in the morning on October 30th, 1 day earlier than she'd said she would. She came up the spiral staircase from the wine cellar and entered the study with a file tucked beneath one arm. Gideon was sitting behind his desk. He pointed toward the chair across from him, but she didn't sit down. She stood there, her face pale beneath the desk lamp, and placed the file on the table before saying a single word. She said she'd run the tests a second time to make certain, and a third time with a control sample. Then she told him the first thing. The concentration of formate in his blood was many times higher than the normal level in a healthy person. Formate wasn't something the human body produced naturally at that concentration. It was what remained after the liver metabolized methanol. She said that if a person drank a large amount of methanol all at once, that person would vomit, suffer a severe headache, fall into a coma, and very likely die within 24 hours. But if that person received a very small amount, regularly, a little every day for many months, there would be no acute episode at all. The body would tolerate it. There was only one part of the body that wouldn't tolerate it, and that was the optic nerve. She said formate attacked precisely there, destroying it gradually, both sides at the same time, and that beyond a certain point, the damage was irreversible. She said the dose he'd been receiving wasn't enough to kill him. It was just enough to make him blind. Gideon said nothing. He sat still, both hands resting on the desk. She told him the second thing. Pure methanol was colorless. It had no distinctive odor that a person could recognize, and when mixed into strong liquor, the smell of the alcohol concealed it completely. It didn't alter the taste either. She said that in a decanter holding roughly 24 fluid ounces, only a fraction of a fluid ounce would be enough, and the level of the liquor would rise slightly, so little that almost no one would notice. Then she came to the part that had made her repeat the tests 3 times. Formate wasn't included in any routine laboratory panel. No hospital in this city would automatically look for it in a patient's blood. It would only appear if a doctor deliberately ordered a test for it. And a doctor would only order that test if poisoning was already suspected. She said that if he hadn't called her, and if he hadn't said exactly what he'd said to her that night, no one in the world would ever have found this substance in his blood, even after he'd gone completely blind. Then she opened the file and told him the third thing. She'd obtained a copy of the entire medical record Dr. Preston Hale had created for him, 47 pages. She said she'd read all of it 3 times. There were scan results. There were visual field tests. There were visual evoked potential studies. There were lengthy clinical notes. And there were 4 signatures on the final page. But there wasn't a single page, a single line, or a single laboratory code indicating that mitochondrial DNA testing had ever been performed. She said the disease they'd assigned to him was caused by a mutation in mitochondrial DNA, and the only way in the world to confirm it was through genetic testing for that specific mutation. Without that test, no one had the right to write down that diagnosis. She went on to say that 3 pages of clinical notes in the middle of the record had been typed 4 days before the final blood sample was taken, and on those 3 pages the full name of the disease was already there. She said slowly that the diagnosis had been written before the results existed, and everything done afterward had merely been used to fill in the empty spaces behind it. Gideon remained still, and as she spoke that final sentence, something returned to his mind. Something small that he'd overlooked since August. He remembered the room that day. He remembered asking Hale whether, if the disease was inherited through the maternal line, his mother should have had it. And he remembered that Hale had answered immediately. He hadn't taken even a second to think. He hadn't looked down at the file. He hadn't said, "Let me check." He'd answered smoothly, clearly, completely, like a man who had memorized the response before the question was ever asked. Miriam Kessler closed the file and rested one hand on its cover. She said she'd been practicing medicine for 40 years, and she was going to tell him this exactly once, and then never say it again. She said this wasn't a disease. She said this was a murder carried out over 5 months, committed by one person who had access to what he drank every morning, and by another person with enough expertise to write a piece of paper that would make him believe it was fate. Gideon reached out and pulled the file toward himself. He opened it, turned several pages with 2 fingers, stopped at the page bearing the 4 signatures, then closed it again. He didn't strike the desk. He didn't stand up. The hand resting on the cover of the file didn't tremble at all. What rose inside his chest in that moment wasn't fear, and it wasn't pain. It was something cold and heavy, something that made no sound, something that quietly began rearranging every day of the past 5 months into an order from which he could begin to calculate. He thanked her. He told her she should leave before 3 o'clock. Then he remained alone with 47 pages spread before him, and the desk lamp burning all the way until morning. Aldo Mancuso arrived that afternoon through the wine cellar entrance as well. He placed 2 things on the desk. The first was a handwritten sheet, listing 6 names. Exactly 6 people who had been allowed to enter the sitting room during the previous 5 months without needing anyone's permission. He read each name aloud, along with the number of times that person had been present, the hours they were usually there, and who was responsible whenever that person was absent. Gideon listened to all of it without interrupting. Then Aldo turned to the second sheet and began talking about the cleaning girl. He said she'd signed her employment contract on May 12th through a staffing agency in Dorchester, that her record was clean, that she had no criminal history and no overdue credit card debt. He said she'd begun her first shift on the morning of the 13th. Then he stopped and said he'd compared that information with what Gideon had told him about the timeline, and there was one thing he believed needed to be said. Gideon's first symptom had occurred on May 20th. She had started working there 7 days earlier. Aldo went on to say that he'd checked the community college she'd named. There had been no student named Daphne Donovan enrolled in any program there during the past 10 years. She had studied nursing for 2 years, but at an entirely different school, nearly 25 miles from the one she'd claimed, and she'd dropped out in November 7 years earlier. Aldo stopped there. He reached inside his coat, took out a photograph, and slid it across the desk toward Gideon. It showed a man standing beside a black car, one hand resting on the roof. Aldo said it was a reprint from an old personnel file. Then he said 3 short sentences. He said this man had been your driver. He said this man had died in the warehouse in Chelsea 7 years ago. He said she was his daughter. Gideon picked up the photograph, brought it closer to his eyes, and looked at it for a very long time. He didn't need to see clearly to know who the man was. He placed the photograph back down, face down against the desk, and told Aldo to bring her upstairs. Daphne entered at 8 o'clock that evening. Aldo didn't follow her into the room. He remained at the threshold, closed the door behind her, and stood there with both arms hanging at his sides, saying nothing. There was still only one desk lamp burning in the room. Gideon sat behind the desk. In front of him lay the thick file and the photograph turned face down. He didn't invite her to sit. He told her he was going to state 4 things, and he wanted her to listen to all 4 before saying a single word. He gave her the first. She had begun working in this house on May 12th. 7 days later, for the first time in his life, he hadn't been able to read a line of text on the page in front of him. He said he'd lived in this house for 38 years, and in all those 38 years nothing had ever been wrong with his eyes. Then he gave her the second. Of the 6 people who had access to that room, 4 couldn't tell cold medicine from stomach medicine, and the 5th was the housekeeper, who was 63 years old. There was only one person in this house who knew enough about medicine to understand what could be mixed into liquor without changing its color, its smell, or its taste, and who would know exactly what that substance would damage inside a man's body. That person had studied nursing for 2 years. Then he gave her the third. The night before, he'd asked where she'd studied, and she'd given him a name. He said that name was a lie. He said he knew where she'd studied, how many years she'd been there, and which month she'd dropped out. He said he didn't care that she'd lied. What he cared about was that she'd prepared a false answer in advance for a question that should never have required anything to be hidden. Then he turned the photograph over, rotated it toward her, and pushed it across the desk. He gave her the fourth. He said the name of the man in the picture. He said the man had died in a warehouse in Chelsea on a November night 7 years earlier, and he said the case had been closed without anyone being arrested. Then he said he didn't know what she'd heard over those 7 years, and he had no intention of guessing. But he knew one thing. A daughter who applied for a job scrubbing floors in the home of the man she believed had killed her father didn't do it for the wages. He finished all 4 points and stopped. He hadn't raised his voice once. He didn't stand up. He remained seated in his chair, both hands resting on the file, and the room was so quiet that the ticking of the clock on the mantel could be heard clearly. Daphne stood there with her eyes lowered toward the photograph of her father lying face up on the desk beneath the light. She said nothing. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Aldo remained motionless at the door. Gideon allowed the silence to stretch a little longer before speaking his final sentence, and he said it in exactly the same even voice he'd used from the beginning. "I'm giving you one chance to tell me the truth." Daphne raised her head. She opened her mouth. The first thing she said was that he was right. She said she'd lied about the name of the school, and then she gave him the real name, the year she'd enrolled, the year she'd dropped out, the month it happened, and the reason why. She said her mother had suffered a stroke 3 weeks after her father's funeral, and during that month she'd been forced to choose between 2 things, and she'd chosen the one that kept her mother alive. Then she spoke about the 7 years. She said the case had been closed after 7 weeks with the words "no suspects" written on the final line. No one had been arrested. There had been no trial. And every time she called the police station, they told her the same thing, that the case was closed. She said she'd accepted that for a while, until she remembered what had happened at the funeral itself. She said she'd been standing in the hallway behind the funeral home when she heard 2 men talking in a hidden corner, and one of them had said that the shipment that night had been ordered from the top, that her father was never supposed to run that route. That route wasn't a driver's job. The other man had told him to shut up. She said she hadn't seen their faces. She'd only heard them, and she said that for every night of the 7 years that followed, before she went to sleep, she heard that sentence again. She said she'd applied for a job in this house to find that order. She said she'd opened every drawer a cleaning woman was permitted to open, read every piece of paper left on a desk, lingered longer than necessary in hallways where people were talking. She said she'd found nothing in 5 months. Then she came to the last part. She said that morning, when she'd seen the level of the liquor in the decanter and watched him raise the glass, she'd had 3 seconds to decide. 3 seconds to remain still and let everything continue exactly as it had for the past 5 months. No one knew what she'd seen. No one could have blamed her for anything. She said she hadn't done that, and then she told him why. She said that if she'd stood still during those 3 seconds, she would have become exactly the kind of thing she'd hated for 7 years, and after that she would have had no right to keep searching for the truth about her father. When she finished, she fell silent. Aldo was still standing at the door. He didn't move, but his eyes had shifted toward Gideon and remained there. In 30 years, he'd stood at doors like this many times, and he knew exactly which moment was the moment when an order would be given. This was that moment. He waited. Gideon said nothing. 1 minute passed. Then 2. Aldo remained exactly where he was, and no order came. Finally, Gideon spoke, and what he said had nothing to do with anything that had just been said in that room. He asked whether she remembered the name of the employment agency that had sent her there. Daphne looked up, confused. She gave him the name of the company. Gideon nodded. Then he said that the company had been established 7 years earlier, that it had 4 employees and a small office in Dorchester, and that the person whose name appeared on its business license was a lawyer who had worked for his family for 20 years. He said the company belonged to him. Then he continued, still in that same even voice, and said that he'd known who she was from the very first day. Not since the night before. Not from Aldo's report. From the first day, he said he was the one who had hired her. Daphne stood frozen in the middle of the room. She couldn't say a word. Gideon explained briefly, as though he were laying out a clause in a contract. He said that 7 years earlier, he'd needed to know where she lived, what she did, what she ate, whom she owed money to, and he'd needed to know all of it, without her ever realizing that someone was paying attention. He said he'd watched her work 3 jobs at once for years, and he'd calculated that at that pace, she would collapse before she turned 40. He said that when a position opened in this house, he'd instructed that company to move her application to the top of the list. He said bringing her into his own house was the only way he could control the wages she received, the hours she worked, and make sure nothing happened to her, while still allowing her to believe she'd gotten the job on her own. Then he stopped. He spoke the next sentence more slowly. He said her father had died because of him. Not because of risk, not because of bad luck, but because of him. He said he'd been there that night, and he'd sat on the concrete floor holding that man in his arms until he stopped breathing. He said that before he died, her father had asked one thing of him, and he'd made a promise. Daphne asked what that promise had been. Gideon didn't answer. She asked again, and this time her voice had changed. He still didn't answer. He only looked toward her through the gray haze before his eyes and said nothing at all. Daphne stood there for several more seconds, then turned, walked straight past Aldo, opened the door, and rushed into the hallway. The sound of her footsteps ran down the stairs, growing fainter and fainter, until it disappeared completely. Aldo closed the door. He didn't ask anything. The next morning, Daphne didn't report for her 5 o'clock shift. She took the first train down to Braintree and waited outside the care center for nearly an hour until the accounting office opened. She presented her documents and said she was Nora Donovan's sole authorized medical representative, and she requested the complete billing statements from the day her mother had been admitted until the present. The woman behind the counter checked the records, excused herself, and went into the back, then returned 15 minutes later carrying a thick stack of printed pages. She placed them on the counter and told Daphne she could sit on the row of chairs in the hallway and look through them. Daphne sat down and opened the first page. The column on the left listed the month. The middle column showed the total cost. The column on the right was divided into 2 parts, one showing the amount paid by the family and the other showing the amount paid by a third party. The total monthly cost was $9,200. Her share was $3,100. She knew that number. She'd lived with that number for 7 years, calculated it in her head every time she received a paycheck, divided it into individual work shifts. But in the column on the right was another number she'd never seen before. $6,100. She turned to the next page. Still, 6,100. The page after that was the same. She began turning faster, month after month, year after year, and the number never changed once, never missed a month, never arrived a day late. She reached the pages near the end, August of that year, September, and October as well. During the 6 weeks when the entire Brookline house had nearly stopped functioning, when its owner hadn't signed a single document and hadn't taken a single phone call, the $6,100 had still been transferred on the 3rd day of the month, exactly as it had been for the previous 84 months. She turned back to the first page and searched for the name of the payer. It was printed in the upper right corner, in the same size type as everything else on the page, without a border, without bold lettering. The Donovan Fund. Daphne read the line 3 times, then she lowered the stack of papers into her lap, and after that, she let it slide to the floor. She slid down with it, sitting on the hallway floor with her back against the leg of the chair, and she remained there for a very long time. 7 years. For 7 years she'd stood in that man's kitchen and scrubbed his floors and counted the days until she could find enough evidence to destroy him. For 7 years she'd repeated the story in her mind about the man who had ordered her father onto that route. And throughout all 7 of those years, once every month, that same man had paid the portion she could never have afforded, under a name she never would have seen if not for that morning, and not once had he allowed even half a word of it to reach her. A caregiver passing through the hallway stopped and asked whether she was all right. Daphne said she was fine, gathered the papers from the floor, and went into her mother's room. Nora was sitting on the bed, facing the window. Daphne pulled a chair closer, took her mother's hand, and sat quietly. After about 10 minutes, Nora turned toward her, stared at her for a long time as though trying to remember something, then asked whether Tom was home yet. Daphne gently squeezed her mother's hand and answered that he'd be home soon, that she should rest, that he'd be back soon. She said exactly the same words, in exactly the same voice, as she'd done for 7 years. She stayed until nearly noon. That evening, she returned to the Brookline mansion. She didn't call ahead. She didn't send a message. She went straight upstairs to the study, knocked twice, and stepped inside. Gideon was sitting behind his desk. She didn't say a single word about Braintree, didn't mention the billing statements, didn't mention the name printed in the corner of the page. She said she'd come to ask what he intended to do next. Gideon looked in her direction for a moment, then answered. He said that from that day forward, everything he ate and drank would be prepared by her alone. She would shop outside the house herself, using cash he gave her, choosing a different place every time, and never buying regularly from the same store. She would cook in the secondary kitchen behind the laundry room, where no one went after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She would bring the food upstairs through the service entrance at the end of the east hallway. He said the main kitchen would continue sending trays upstairs as usual, at the usual time, with the usual dishes, and those trays would still be brought into his room. He said that food would go into the orchid pot in the corner, along with everything else. Daphne listened to all of it, then asked him one question. She asked why he trusted her after everything she'd said the night before, after she'd admitted that she'd come into his house looking for a way to destroy him. Gideon didn't answer immediately. Then he said he didn't trust her. He said he trusted those 3 seconds. Daphne stood still for a moment, her mind racing between 7 years of accumulated hatred and the overwhelming weight of the truth she had just uncovered in Braintree. She didn't ask anything else. She looked him in the eye and said she would begin with breakfast the next morning. She made it clear she wasn't doing this out of forgiveness, but because the man who had secretly kept her mother alive didn't deserve to die in the dark before the full truth about her father came to light. Then she turned, walked out, and closed the door behind her. While Daphne began preparing the first breakfast in the secondary kitchen, Aldo Mancuso received another instruction. Gideon told him that over the next 7 days, he wanted to know every step taken by all 6 people on the list, and he wanted each one watched individually, without leaving anyone out, including those Aldo himself believed weren't worth the trouble. Aldo began on November 1st. He reported back at 2 o'clock in the morning on November 8th, entering through the wine cellar door with a thin briefcase and a handheld recorder. He offered no opening words. He opened the case, took out a stack of large photographs, and laid them on the desk. He said that during those 7 days, 5 people on the list had done nothing noteworthy. The 6th had gone 3 times to the same place. He said the location was an abandoned boat repair yard along Chelsea Creek, closed since 2011, with no electricity, no cameras, and no security. He said all 3 visits had taken place at around 10 o'clock at night, and each time the person had arrived in a rented car registered under a different name. The photographs had been taken from the roof of a warehouse 3 blocks away, grainy because the lens had been pushed to its limit, but clear enough. Gideon picked up each photograph and brought it close to the desk lamp. In the first, a man was stepping out of a car and walking toward a side door. In the second, he had stopped beneath the only streetlight still burning at the end of the road, and for those 2 seconds his face had turned directly toward the camera. It was Julian Croft. In the third photograph, another man stood waiting in the doorway, with 2 guards a few steps behind him. Gideon recognized him even with his eyes in their present condition. Cormac Halloran, 57 years old, head of the Irish organization in Charlestown, the man who had opposed the Vitali family since Gideon's father was still alive, and the only man in the city who hadn't sat at the same table with Gideon in 20 years. Aldo placed the recorder on the desk and said he'd managed to get close enough only once, on the 3rd night, and had captured less than 2 minutes. He pressed the button. The first voice to fill the room was Julian's. It was warm, slow, patient, the same voice that had read reports aloud to Gideon every afternoon for 6 weeks, the same voice that had said the old man wouldn't want to see him give up this habit. He was explaining something to the person across from him, and he was explaining it very clearly. He spoke about Section 14 of the Vitali Holdings Trust document, the trust that controlled all of the family's legitimate assets, from harbor leases to real estate companies. He said the provision stated that if the primary beneficiary were certified by 2 specialists as permanently incapacitated, management authority over the entire estate would pass to the successor designated in the document. He said that successor was him, and that Gideon himself had signed the provision 4 years earlier. He said the petition for recognition had already been filed, the medical documentation was complete, and the matter would be considered at the annual meeting of the Board of Trustees on December 14th. He emphasized that the date was fixed by the governing rules, that the board met only once a year, and that no one had the authority to move it forward or back by even a single day. Then he spoke about what would come afterward. He said he needed 3 months to stabilize things, to let the capos become accustomed to taking orders from him, to make sure no one asked questions. After those 3 months, all the leases at Conley Wharf and in Chelsea would be transferred to the Halloran side through proper paperwork, cleanly, without anyone having to fire a single shot. The second voice came through, drier and much slower. Halloran asked only one question. He asked what would happen to Vitali. There was a brief silence on the recording, then Julian answered. He said no one was to touch him. He said a blind man living in a house he no longer owned, sitting in the same place every day, drinking from the same glass, unable to see who was walking through the door. He said it was cleaner that way. Then he added 3 final words, and he said them in the same unchanged, warm voice. And it hurts more. Aldo pressed the stop button. Nothing remained in the room except the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Gideon sat completely motionless in his chair. He didn't stand, didn't reach for the photographs, didn't say a word for nearly 2 minutes. He didn't think about 12 years earlier, and the overturned car in the ditch along Route 93. He didn't think about the night in Chelsea 7 years before. He didn't think about the hand that had squeezed his shoulder once and then let go. The only thing moving through his mind was a calculation, and that calculation produced one number. Today was the 8th. 36 days remained. Aldo asked how he wanted it handled, and he asked in the voice of a man prepared to walk out the door that very night. Gideon shook his head. He said there were 2 heads out there, not one. He said if they cut one off too early, the other would retreat to New Jersey or Charlestown, lie still for 2 years, then grow back in exactly the same place. He said he didn't want revenge against one man. He wanted the entire alliance to break apart at the same moment, loudly enough that 20 years from now no one in this city would still mistake his patience for weakness. Then he told Aldo to put the photographs away and keep watching. 3 nights later, Daphne brought the tray upstairs and didn't leave immediately as she usually did. She remained standing in the middle of the room and said she wanted to see the file from the night in Chelsea. She said she'd spent 3 days thinking about it, and she wanted to see everything. Not the version the police had released, but the version belonging to the organization itself. Gideon didn't ask why. He stood, walked to the filing cabinet behind his desk, unlocked it, and took out 3 thick folders. He placed all 3 on the table and told her that inside were copies of the police records, internal reports, the duty roster for the 17 people who had been present that night, call logs, and even things that, if they ever became public, would put him in prison. He told her to read. Then he sat down across from her. They remained that way throughout the entire night. Neither of them addressed the other by any title. No one stood at the door. For the first time in 5 months, the 2 of them occupied the same room as equals, each with a stack of papers, sliding pages back and forth across the table. Gideon read slowly because of his eyes, and there were lines he had to bring close to the lamp. Daphne read faster, and she read the way someone trained in documentation would read, pencil in hand, underlining, numbering the margins, setting aside every page that contained a point in time. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, she stopped at one sheet and didn't turn to the next page. It was a printout of the call log from that night. She asked him one question. She asked what number had called at 9:41 that evening. Gideon said it was his private line, a number that appeared in no directory, wasn't used for ordinary business, and existed only for emergencies directly connected to shipments at the docks. He said that call was the reason he'd been in Chelsea that night, because the caller had reported that there was a problem with a shipment and that he needed to come down immediately. Daphne asked how many people knew that number. Gideon said 4. She asked him to name them. He gave her all 4 names. She wrote each one along the edge of the page, then lowered her pencil and looked at him. She said the first man had died 10 months after that night, from illness, and she said she knew because she'd seen his name in an old personnel list. She said the second man had died 5 months after that night, and asked Gideon whether that was correct. Gideon said it was, She said the third was Aldo Mancuso. Then she pulled toward herself the duty roster she'd separated from the other papers at the beginning of the night, turned to the page for that date, and rotated it toward him. During those 3 days, Aldo Mancuso hadn't been in Boston. He'd been sent to Providence the morning before and hadn't returned until noon the following day, with the signatures of 2 people confirming it and a hotel receipt attached to the next page. Daphne didn't say the name of the 4th person. She simply placed the sheet in the middle of the table and left it there. Gideon looked down at the 4 names written in pencil along the edge of the page. He'd read this file many times during the past 7 years. He'd read it on nights when he couldn't sleep, had gone through every statement, every report, but not once had he sat down and asked himself who had known that private number, because the question had never entered his mind. People don't inspect a door they believe has already been locked. The next morning, he sent for Miriam Kessler. She arrived that evening, and he asked her one question only: who had treated Julian Croft's shoulder wound 7 years earlier. She said she had. She said she remembered it clearly because that night she'd worked in the kitchen of a house in Somerville, without an operating table and without surgical lights. Gideon told her to retrieve the records from that case. She left and returned 2 hours later with a folder whose edges had yellowed with age. She opened it, reread the notes she'd written herself 7 years earlier, and remained silent for a very long time before speaking. She said there was one line in the record that she'd written that night and hadn't thought about once in the 7 years since. The line said there were powder burns around the entrance wound and unburned grains of gunpowder embedded in the skin. She said that pattern only appeared when the muzzle of the gun had been less than about 12 inches from the point of impact. She said that at the time she'd had no reason to question it, because he'd been brought to her with the explanation that he'd been shot during an ambush, and her only responsibility had been to close the wound. She said she'd written down exactly what she'd seen, then closed the file and put it away. No one in the room said anything for a long while. No gunman in an ambush fired from 12 inches away. At that distance, the shooter and the person being shot were standing almost against each other, and the shooter knew exactly what he was doing. Daphne sat in the chair across from Gideon, both hands resting on her thighs. She'd understood before Kessler finished the last sentence. Her father had died that night so another man could acquire a scar on his shoulder, and for the 7 years that followed, that scar had become a kind of unquestioned credential that no one in the organization dared challenge. It had been purchased with another man's blood, and that man had been her father. Daphne didn't cry. She sat motionless for a long time, then lifted her eyes toward Gideon and asked exactly one question. She asked why. Gideon didn't answer. He didn't yet have an answer he could give her. By the end of November, Daphne had been cooking for him for nearly 4 weeks. The first thing Gideon noticed wasn't that his vision was becoming clearer, but that the pain was easing. One evening, he was sitting in the armchair near the fireplace and forgot to turn his face away. The flames were burning directly in front of him, about 6.5 feet away, and he'd been sitting there for nearly 10 minutes before it suddenly struck him that there was no drill driving into the backs of his eyes. For the past 4 months, even a candle at that distance had been enough to make him raise a hand to shield himself. He remained still, staring directly into the fire for a long while longer, before finally getting up and returning to his desk. A few days later, a copy of the Globe was left on his breakfast tray. He picked it up out of habit, intending to push it aside as he'd done for months, when his eyes caught on the small line of print beneath a photograph in the corner of the page. He could read it, not the large headline, but the caption printed in the smallest type on the entire page. He read it a second time to make sure, then folded the newspaper and told no one. Then, one evening in early December, Aldo came to give his report and stood waiting at the threshold as he always did, about 16 feet from the desk. Gideon looked up and saw his face, not a pale shape drifting in gray mist. He could see the 2 deep lines running down either side of Aldo's mouth, the old scar at the outer edge of his left eyebrow, even the way his eyes narrowed slightly while he waited for permission to speak. Gideon nearly sprang to his feet. He didn't. He simply nodded for Aldo to come in and listen to the entire report without revealing anything. From that day forward, he hid it more carefully than ever. He continued wearing the amber-tinted glasses all day and kept them on even in dark rooms. He still moved along the wall whenever he walked through the hallway, his fingertips brushing lightly against the wallpaper. One morning, while Julian was reading a report aloud, Gideon reached behind himself for the back of the chair and deliberately let his hand miss it by about 8 inches before finally finding the place he meant to touch. Julian stopped reading, stood, pulled the chair a little closer to him, then sat back down and continued. Neither man said anything about it. That evening, Daphne brought the tray upstairs through the service entrance as usual. She set it on the table, straightened the utensils, and was preparing to leave when Gideon called her name. She stopped. He raised a hand, removed the amber-tinted glasses, folded them, and placed them on the table. Then he lifted his eyes and looked at her. It was the first time in more than 5 months that he'd seen the face of the woman who had passed through this room every day. He noticed her hands first, because they were resting on the edge of the tray. Thick calluses covered her knuckles, and the skin across the backs of her hands was reddened from hot water and industrial soap. He saw the dark circles lying deep beneath her eyes, the kind that didn't come from one sleepless night but from years of sleeping 3 hours a day. And he saw the watch on her left wrist, an oversized man's watch with a worn leather strap, fastened through the innermost hole and still too loose, sliding down toward her hand every time she moved. Gideon looked at that watch for a moment before speaking. He said she'd been in this house for 5 months. He said he'd passed the place where she stood every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, and in those 5 months he'd never asked her a single question. He said he hadn't known where she lived until Aldo told him. He said he wasn't even sure whether he'd ever heard anyone in this house call her by name. Daphne stood quietly for a moment before answering. She said no one ever asked. She said it had been the same everywhere she'd ever worked. People saw the broom and the bucket, not the person holding them, and there was no bitterness in the way she said it, only the plainness of something she'd long accepted as fact. She said that was her job. Gideon shook his head. He said no. He said that was his mistake. Then he told her 2 things. He said he would uncover the entire truth about the night in Chelsea. Not part of it, but all of it, including the part that would leave him responsible for what he'd done. And he said that when all of this was over, he would send her back to nursing school so she could finish the remaining 2 years. Daphne looked at him for a long time. Then she smiled. It was the first time he'd ever seen her smile, and it lasted less than 2 seconds. She told him not to make promises he couldn't keep, that she'd heard enough promises like that over the past 7 years, from lawyers, from police officers, from people who said they would help and then never called again. Gideon answered with a single sentence. He said he'd never broken a promise to anyone in his entire life. She said nothing more. She picked up the empty tray and walked out, and he remained seated, watching her until the door had closed completely. Sometimes light returns not so that we can see the world again, but so that we can finally see the person who stood beside us through all the days we spent in darkness. Julian Croft wasn't a man who could be deceived for long, and during the first week of December, 3 things began to trouble him. The first was the stairs. According to the timetable he'd calculated back in May, Gideon should have missed a step at least once by this stage. There should have been some morning when the entire house heard a crash and came running to help him up. It had never happened. Not once. The second was the orchid in the corner of the room. The gardener had replaced the plant 10 days earlier, and that morning when Julian came in to read the reports, he glanced toward it and saw that the 2 lowest leaves had begun turning yellow from the edges inward. He said nothing, but he stood there longer than necessary. The third was the liquor. For 3 mornings in a row, Gideon had allowed him to pour only half the usual amount before waving him off, saying his stomach had been bothering him lately. Those 3 signs added up to something Julian had enough experience to understand. Someone in the house had talked, and if someone had talked, then he didn't have 36 days anymore. He had only 8. The petition to have Gideon declared incapacitated was already sitting before the Board of Trustees, but the trust rules allowed the beneficiary himself to attend the meeting and object. And if Gideon objected, the board would be required to postpone its decision and request an independent medical panel appointed by the court. 3 new doctors, none of them chosen by Julian, would begin the testing again from the start. Julian knew exactly what those tests would reveal, and he knew the result would destroy him completely, not merely cost him the succession, but put him in handcuffs. He didn't need Gideon blind. He only needed Gideon quiet and willing to sign. On Saturday morning, December 6th, Daphne was cleaning the 2nd floor hallway when the phone in her apron pocket began to vibrate. She looked at the number and recognized the prefix from the care center in Braintree. The voice of the woman on the other end sounded confused rather than frightened, and she began by apologizing for calling on the weekend. She said she only wanted to confirm a small procedural detail so that everything would be properly documented. She said that someone had come that morning to discharge Nora Donovan, carrying complete medical power of attorney papers, notarized documents, copies of identification, and everything had appeared valid, so the center had no legal reason to refuse the discharge. She said the man had identified himself as Daphne's brother. Then she asked whether Daphne knew about it. The phone slipped from Daphne's hand and struck the hardwood floor. She didn't have a brother. She had never had a brother. 2 hours later, a white envelope was placed on Gideon's desk. No stamp, no postmark, no sender's name. No one in the house knew how it had appeared. Inside was a sheet of paper with exactly 3 printed lines. The first gave the date December 14th and told him to sign the papers. The second said that the woman would come home safely. The third said not to do anything stupid, because she didn't even know where she was. Gideon read all 3 lines, folded the paper, and placed it on the desk. He sat still for several seconds, then told the man outside the door to bring Daphne upstairs. She arrived still holding the cleaning cloth in one hand. He gave her the note. She read it, then read it a second time, and afterward she sank to the floor exactly where she stood. She began to speak, her voice breaking, growing louder with every sentence. She said her mother didn't know where she was, didn't remember her own name, couldn't even remember the name of her daughter, and every day she simply sat facing the window asking when a man who'd been dead for 7 years was coming home. She said she'd sold everything she could sell, worked 3 jobs for 7 years, hadn't bought herself anything in 7 years just to keep her mother in that room, and she said that all she had left in the world was one woman who couldn't remember her name. After saying it, she collapsed forward, both hands covering her head, her shoulders shaking in waves. Gideon didn't tell her everything would be all right. He didn't tell her he understood. He stood, walked around the desk, and lowered himself in front of her. He placed one hand on her shoulder and kept it there until she lifted her head. Then he said exactly 3 sentences to her. He told her to look at him. He said he'd never broken a promise to anyone in his life. He said he wasn't going to start with her. He stood, opened the bottom drawer, took out the flip phone, and dialed the familiar number. Aldo answered after 2 rings. Gideon told him briefly that he needed to find a 58-year-old woman with dementia who had been removed from a facility in Braintree at 9 o'clock that morning using forged documents, that she needed medication 4 times a day and couldn't tell anyone who she was. Then he told Aldo he had 48 hours. The next morning, Gideon sent for Julian and told him that he'd thought it over, that he would attend the meeting on the 14th and sign. He said he didn't want to drag this out any longer. Julian stood there and listened, then said it was the right decision, that he would take care of everything, and he said it in exactly the same warm voice he'd used throughout the past 7 months. Meanwhile, Aldo Mancuso was doing his work. He didn't go looking for the car. He went looking for paperwork. A woman with severe dementia couldn't simply be taken to an empty house because she needed medication 4 times a day and someone on duty through the night. He traced the transfer records that the Braintree Center was required to prepare when releasing a patient, and those records named a small private care facility in Revere. An entire floor of that facility had been leased by a company registered in Delaware, formed 14 months earlier, with no website and no employees, and the name on the registration belonged to a lawyer who had handled paperwork 3 times for properties connected to Cormac Halloran. Aldo reported back after 31 hours. He asked whether they should move in immediately. Gideon said not yet. He told him to leave 2 men there watching, not to go near the place, not to expose themselves, and to wait until the 14th. Then Gideon did something no one in the Vitali organization expected. He called an attorney he'd remained in contact with for 16 years, a man who didn't work for his family, but worked on the other side, and he sent him 3 things. The first was a complete copy of all 47 pages of Dr. Preston Hale's medical file. The second was a sworn statement from Dr. Miriam Kessler, stating clearly that no mitochondrial DNA test existed anywhere in the file, and that 3 pages of clinical notes had been created before the final sample was taken. The third was the laboratory result showing the formate level in Gideon's blood. The attorney finished reading and told him plainly that this was no longer a state matter. He said, fabricating a medical diagnosis, in order to trigger an incapacity clause in a trust worth several $100 million, constituted healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, and all 3 were federal crimes. He said the file would be on the desk of the United States Attorney's Office in Boston within 48 hours. Gideon understood perfectly well that opening a door to those people meant opening the door into his own house as well, and he signed the authorization anyway. On December 14th, the annual meeting of the Vitali Holdings Board of Trustees took place at a law office on the 31st floor of a building in the financial district. Gideon stepped out of the elevator wearing dark glasses, his left hand resting on Aldo's elbow. He walked slowly, each step slightly uncertain, and allowed Aldo to guide him to the chair before sitting down. There were 7 people in the room. 3 members of the board, 1 secretary, 2 doctors invited to provide professional confirmation, and Julian Croft seated at the far end of the table with both hands resting comfortably on its surface. One of the 2 doctors was Preston Hale. The secretary read Section 14 aloud, read the portion citing the medical record, read the name of the designated successor, then pushed the document and a pen across the table toward Gideon. Gideon reached out and took the pen. He stopped. Then he raised his other hand, removed the dark glasses, folded them, and placed them on the table. He pulled the document toward himself and began reading aloud. He read from the first line, read all of Section 14, continued into the definition of permanent incapacity, then turned to the bottom of the page and read the footnote printed in 8-point type, the line that even a person with normal eyesight would have needed to lean close to read. He read clearly, without stumbling over a single word. No one in the room moved. The secretary stopped typing. One board member turned to look at the person beside him. Julian Croft remained still, both hands still resting on the tabletop, without pulling them back. Gideon lowered the document and continued in an ordinary voice. He said Section 14 required the diagnosis to be confirmed by mitochondrial genetic testing. He said that test had never been performed, that it appeared nowhere in the 47 pages of records, that there was no laboratory code for it, and no laboratory had ever signed off on receiving such a sample. Then he turned toward Hale and asked whether he wanted to explain it himself, or whether Gideon should read Dr. Miriam Kessler's sworn statement aloud. Hale's face went white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, and then he sank back into his chair. Gideon opened the leather case beside his feet and removed each item one by one, placing them on the table in order. The laboratory report showing the formate concentration in his blood, stamped and signed, Kessler's sworn statement, a copy of the emergency treatment record from 7 years earlier, containing the note about powder burns from a gun fired at a distance of less than 12 inches, the photographs taken from the warehouse roof near Chelsea Creek, and finally, the handheld recorder. He didn't switch it on. He simply placed it beside everything else. No one in the room said a word. Then, Gideon lifted his head and looked directly at Julian Croft, seeing his face clearly, more clearly than he'd seen anyone in the past 7 months, and he asked one question. He asked why. He said it wasn't about money, because if Julian had wanted money, he could have taken it at any time during the past 12 years and Gideon would never have known. Then he asked again, more slowly, why? Julian Croft didn't deny it. He sat quietly for a while, then smiled, the tired smile of a man who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. He raised a hand and pulled down the collar of his shirt, exposing the round scar on his left shoulder. Then he asked Gideon whether he remembered Peter Ashby. Gideon sat there and searched his memory. There was nothing. Not a face, not a voice, not a single detail. And that emptiness was the worst thing in the entire room that day, Julian reminded him. He said that 13 years earlier, there had been a 22-year-old soldier who was caught keeping part of the money collected in Everett. He said the young man had kept $900 to pay for his mother's medicine. He said Gideon had received the call, reporting it while he was eating dinner, listened to everything, then answered with 4 words, that the entire call had lasted 11 seconds, and afterward Gideon had put down the phone and continued eating. Julian said he knew it had been exactly 11 seconds, because he'd obtained the call record years later. Then he told him the rest. He said Peter Ashby was his older brother. He said he'd carried his mother's last name since he was 9 years old, when their parents divorced, so no one in the organization had ever connected the 2 names. He said that 1 year after his brother died, he'd deliberately driven that car into the ditch beside Route 93 on exactly the right Tuesday night, along exactly that stretch of road, at exactly the hour he'd spent 4 months watching to make certain Gideon would pass. He said he'd lain inside the wreck and waited. He said he'd never wanted to kill Gideon, because death was too quick and too easy. He said he wanted to climb all the way to the place where Gideon stood, and then take everything from him. Then he spoke about 12 years. He said he'd eaten dinner with Gideon 1,000 times, had taken a bullet for him, had poured Gideon's father's liquor for him every morning, and through all 12 of those years, Gideon had never once remembered his brother's name. He looked directly at Gideon and said the final sentence. "You didn't kill me with a gun. You killed me by not remembering." That afternoon, on an empty lot beside Chelsea Creek, Cormac Halloran's men brought Nora Donovan to exchange her for the file. Aldo's men were positioned on the rooftops around them, but Gideon had given a clear order that morning that no one was to fire a single shot, no matter what happened. He'd chosen to end this with paperwork, not bullets. Nora stepped out of the car, looked around in confusion, then asked where Tom was. Aldo walked forward, took her gently by the arm, and helped her into the other car first, with the tenderness of a man helping his own mother. Halloran opened the file and immediately realized that everything inside was only a copy, that the originals had already been sitting on the desk of the United States Attorney's Office for 2 days. He drew a gun and aimed it at Daphne, who was standing only a few steps away. Gideon turned and put himself in front of her. A gunshot cracked through the air. He was hit in the left shoulder and fell onto the concrete. At that same instant, sirens rushed in from both ends of the road, and everything was over in less than 4 seconds, without another shot being fired. Julian Croft was led past Gideon in handcuffs. Aldo dropped to one knee beside him and looked at him, waiting for a nod, the nod that everyone in the organization understood. Daphne was kneeling on the other side, both hands pressed tightly against Gideon's shoulder, and she told him not to do it. That if he did, then her father would have died for a man no different from the one who killed him. Gideon looked at Aldo and shook his head. "Give him to them," he said. 2 months later, his left shoulder carried a scar, and the arm remained slightly stiff on cold mornings. His vision recovered to about 80%, leaving only a permanent blur at the edge of his field of view that the doctors said would never disappear. Julian Croft, Preston Hale, and Cormac Halloran were all indicted in federal court on charges of fraud and conspiracy. No one died. And Gideon Vitale also paid a price for opening the door with his own hand and allowing those people in coats to enter his house. A price he'd known was coming from the day he signed the authorization. One afternoon near the end of winter, Serena Whitlock returned. She brought flowers and a carefully prepared apology. Gideon listened to all of it. Then he told her that she hadn't been the one who put poison in his liquor, but she had been the one who left him alone in the darkness, and that alone had told him everything he needed to know. She stood and walked out, and he didn't see her to the door. Nora Donovan returned to her old room in Braintree. One afternoon, Gideon came with Daphne and stopped in the doorway. Nora turned and looked at him for a long time, then asked whether he'd come to pick up Tom. Gideon stepped inside, pulled a chair beside the bed, and took her hand. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can wait." That spring, Daphne returned to nursing school to complete the 2 years she'd left unfinished. She refused to let Gideon pay her tuition. The two of them sat down with a lawyer and signed a proper loan agreement, with interest, to be repaid in installments over 10 years, and Gideon signed without arguing a single word, because he understood that this was how she held on to her dignity. The evening after the papers were signed, he told her the thing he'd kept to himself for 7 years. He said that on the night in Chelsea, before Thomas Donovan died, he'd grabbed Gideon by the collar and said exactly one thing: "Look after my little girl for me." Gideon said that for 7 years he'd kept that promise with money, transferring it every month without missing a single one, and he said that had been the most cowardly and easiest way a man could choose to keep a promise. Daphne sat quietly for a while, then placed her hand over his and said, "Then from now on, keep it a different way." This story leaves us with something very simple. When we're shining, everyone wants to stand beside us, but only when we fall into darkness do we discover who truly stays. Every person we pass each day without bothering to notice, the person cleaning the hallway, the person serving our table, the person working the night shift at a warehouse, is the most important person in someone else's life. Cruelty and indifference always feed the very thing that will one day return to destroy them, while the kindness we give and then forget may someday come back and stand between us and disaster. See people while they're still beside you, and call them by name while there's still time. If today's story touched you, please subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so that more meaningful stories can reach you every day. How did this story make you feel? And has there ever been someone in your life who stayed beside you during your hardest time? Or someone you still pass every day without ever asking their name? Please leave a comment below. We truly want to hear what you feel deep in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.